Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is Maggie McGrath, editor of ForbesWomen. Maggie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So as we sit here the day after Election Day, it's just a few months after Roe v. Wade was overturned back in June. So now in November, let's reflect. How much of the issue of abortion mattered to voters?
As we're seeing from exit polling, a tremendous amount. Exit polling shows that the top two issues that voters were considering as they went into the polls yesterday were inflation and abortion. In that order, though I would argue that the two are deeply intertwined.
So let's take a step back. So in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned back in June, there have been polls conducted about how Americans feel about abortion. Can you walk us through that?
I think it's important, and it does depend on the poll that you're looking at and talking about. But speaking broadly, a majority of Americans don't want to see abortion be illegal. Most Americans, anywhere between 55, 60, 63, 65, again, it depends on the polls, but more than 50% of Americans say that abortion in some form should be legal. So we have a majority of Americans who feel that the Dobbs decision in June, which overturned Roe v. Wade and took away the federal legal right to abortion, meaning that now it's in the hands of the states, I think a lot of Americans thought that was a really extreme decision. And then we're seeing in the exit polling a reflection that that issue didn't go away when the calendar turned to July.
So let's break that down. Are more women feeling that way, or are men leading that charge as well?
A lot of the polling I've looked at hasn't broken down women or men, but I know some of the individual state polling heading into the election. I'll use Oklahoma as an example, where we did see the incumbent Governor Stitt hold on to his seat, but he received a pretty stiff challenge from Joy Hoffmeister. She changed her affiliation. She was a lifelong Republican, school superintendent, and one of the issues that was helping her in the polling were women in Oklahoma cities plural, not Oklahoma City alone, were supporting her because they found that Stitt's anti-abortion legislation was just too extreme. Numbers didn't totally bear out for her. She was not one of the women who won last night, but I do think it was top of mind for a lot of women.
So how much would you say did the issue of abortion and reproductive rights in general energize voters, particularly Democrats?
It's hard to put a number on it, but I think if you see the abortion measures, there were 5 last night. There's still one that we're waiting on the results. And if you look at some of the governor races, I think it can't be overstated. I think a lot of the feminist activists who you've heard over the past few months saying that this is important, they were right. Everyone who was sounding the alarm saying we can't go back, we won't go back, I think there's proof that a lot of people agree with those sentiments.
Yeah, and for months we've been hearing from pollsters, from really everyone, that there was this red wave kind of coming. That didn't come to fruition last night. Do you think abortion played a key role in that?
I do. I think women are angry. I think anger is a powerful emotion in any arena, but if you think about the number of women who have been running for seats in recent years, we called it the pink wave back in 2018. There was anger about the election results in 2016. And when people are angry, and I've heard this from women I interview all the time, I ask them, prominent leaders and entrepreneurs, like, when do you decide to use your platform? One of them told me recently, when I'm pissed off. So I think you're seeing that when you're angry, you take your voice and you use it in some capacity. And for a lot of the women in this election cycle, we have women using their voice as their vote, and you also had women using their voice as running for a seat.
So did Republicans miscalculate how big of an issue abortion was going to be?
In my opinion, yes.
So you talked about voters in 5 different states reacting to ballot measures that had anti-abortion measures on them. Can you break that down for us?
Yes. So it's the wording of each of these measures is very complicated. We had a few that were worded in a way that would enshrine protection for reproductive health decisions into their state constitution or legislation. Then there are the other trickier, protect the unborn, or doctors, a mandate for doctors. So let's break that down. I'll start with California because that one's pretty simple. They enshrined the right to abortion in the state constitution.
So this can never be changed, right?
So currently California does is one of the states where abortion is legal, and the state constitution allows a right to privacy, which has long been what Roe was decided on. You have the decision is between you and your doctor. But I think following the leak of the Supreme Court decision in May, when it was still just a draft, Governor Newsom and other state politicians decided, let's make sure there's no shadow of a doubt, and let's have this ballot measure to further protect the right to reproductive choice in this state.
Let's talk about Vermont next.
I think this one's really interesting because the language that voters were voting on was expansive. It is, and I'm going to read from here to make sure I get it right. Protect every person's right to make their own reproductive decisions. That means a lot of things. That means contraception. That means IVF. That means maybe you're being told by a doctor that it's a high-risk pregnancy, but you have the choice to go through with that pregnancy. It is protecting all sorts of reproductive decisions, which I think is really important because we want choice for everyone in how they craft their family.
And what was the response for voters on this measure?
There was a vote in 2018 where they were voting on abortion access. More voters came out this year than came out in 2018. So they voted in favor of reproductive choice by a wide percentage.
And let's talk about Kentucky next.
Kentucky was one of those states where voters were voting on something a little trickily worded, if you will. They were voting on a measure to say that an amendment to the state constitution to say that it does not, quote, secure or protect a right to abortion or funding of the abortion. So it's like a negative of a negative, basically.
Is this meant to trick people?
You would have to ask the people who write the legislation. I think a lot of times the wording is confusing, and I would argue that that's probably not a coincidence.
Got it.
But Kentucky is a state where abortion rights have been curtailed, so it's not as if this suddenly undoes all of this. I think the biggest takeaway in Kentucky is pro-abortion activists and lawyers will be able to continue fighting against the anti-abortion legislation or any further pullbacks in rights.
Maggie, you and I are both from the great state of Pennsylvania, and last night Pennsylvania Democrat Josh Shapiro beat out his GOP Republican challenger Doug Mastriano. So what does this mean in terms of reproductive rights?
It means, and Shapiro had campaigned on this, that any sort of abortion ban proposal that crossed the governor's desk, Shapiro will veto.
Okay, now moving on to some southern states, Republican incumbent governors held on to their seats in both Georgia as well as Florida. So what does this mean for abortion rights in those states?
They've already been curtailed, so let's put it this way, they're not getting expanded under these governors.
And some races in Arizona moving across the country haven't been called as of now as we're sitting here. So what does that mean for reproductive rights there? Or is it up in the air?
It's up in the air. I think Arizona is so close, I don't even want to comment. I mean, what I would say is from my seat as the ForbesWomen editor, you have a woman running against a woman, so we're guaranteed to get a female governor there, which would then add to an historic number of women who've been elected governor. But as far as abortion rights are concerned, I think right now we're just waiting to know who wins the race.
So last night, were you surprised to see abortion such a motivating issue to voters?
I was not, and for a number of reasons. Obviously, I cover the women's space. I talk to a lot of women. I am not a pollster, to be clear, but I do know this issue has been top of mind for women, and whether or not they are answering polls, they're thinking about it. And just this week, I talked to a few venture capitalists who formed VCs for Repro Rights. And it's a collection of venture capitalists with $100 billion in assets under management who have come out in support of reproductive choice. And I hear it in the minds of founders who are thinking about, what should I be doing for my employees? Should I be providing travel assistance if they need to travel out of state? Just last week, we reported that 1 in 3 women need to travel more than an hour from their home to obtain an abortion if they need one. That came from a report out of the Journal of American Medicine. So the headlines have been coming. I think the question that I have for pollsters is, why was that sentiment perhaps underrepresented in the polling or in the data that they received? But the conversations that I've been having, the reporting I've been having, this issue hasn't gone away since June. It's still very much top of mind for a lot of people.
So Maggie, I do want to talk about what's next. So as we sit here right now, some races haven't been decided in both the House and the Senate. So it's too early to say definitively who's gaining control there. But current forecasts do suggest that the House is going to the GOP and Democrats will retain control of the Senate. So what does this mean in terms of abortion rights?
What's interesting about this scenario is while a lot of pundits were saying last night wasn't bad for President Biden, it wasn't the red wave or tsunami or whatever nautical analogy you wish to use, I do think it ties his hands a little bit because he had said that he would pass legislation that would protect the right to abortion at a national level if Democrats retained control of the House and the Senate. It seems unlikely that they will retain control of the House, so I don't know how he gets that legislation passed if Republicans are in control. So we're at a little bit of a standstill.
And speaking of legislation that was proposed, Senator Lindsey Graham back in September proposed a federal abortion ban at 15 weeks with some exceptions. Do you think that this proposal helped him, hurt him, or had little impact overall in the scheme of the election last night?
I know there are some voters who heard that and thought, that doesn't sound like the Republican talking point that the power should be in the states. That's just stating a fact. I think states' rights was a big part of the Dobbs decision, right? Put this in the hands of the states. And to hear a politician say, actually, let's put this ban at the federal level, I wouldn't fault someone for feeling confused by that and perhaps motivated to vote for a candidate who would maybe provide some clarity on that.
And what do you think the likelihood is of that actually coming to fruition?
I couldn't begin to guess because I think what we've seen, abortion has long been the third rail of politics. You have incredibly motivated politicians on both sides of the issue. But I would just go back to the polling and the surveys that we've seen since Roe was overturned. Americans are broadly in favor of legal abortion in some capacity or another. When we get into the details is where we start to see the disagreements. Mm-hmm. But I think broad national sweeping bans are seen as extreme. So
even by Republicans.
It's going to depend on the survey that you look at. There was a survey in October that showed, do you support a legal right to an abortion in the case of rape or incest? And close to 3/4, 75% of Republicans surveyed said, yes, I do support the right to an abortion in those cases. But that's where you get down to the details. And so when you think about a mass ban with no exceptions, I think something like that would be seen as tremendously unpopular in this country.
Got it. Now, I know we don't have a crystal ball here to really look down the line, but let's look at 2 years from now, come 2024. Do you think we're going to see abortion rights on the ballot again in 2 years? Because anti-abortion measures, by and large last night, even in some historically red states, were rejected.
I think it's going to continue to be an issue, yes. For as long as this is in the hands of the states, we have 50 states. We have not seen ballot measures in all 50 states yet, so I think it's going to keep coming.
Maggie McGrath, thank you so much.
Thank you.